The anticipation builds. Welcome, everybody. My name is Alan Feldstein. I'm member 1094, and I am excited and have the honor of being here for another fabulous presentation at the Adventurers Club of Los Angeles. Today, we're here with Brendan Borrell, who's going to talk to us about an amazing paddle trip on waters that didn't necessarily exist before he started the paddle. So, welcome, Brendan.
Hi, thanks for having me here.
Wow, our pleasure. Let's first start off with a little bit about you and your background and where you're from, and tell us about yourself.
Sure. I was born in Houston, Texas. Grew up catching frogs and snakes in the bayou, and that sort of turned into obsession, which led me to do graduate studies in biology. I first was interested in studying snakes, but my professor there turned me on to tropical bees. So I did my PhD on how bees drink nectar.
Wow.
A particular type of bee known as an orchid bee, which has the longest tongue of any bee. They're kind of jewel-like.
How do you measure a bee's tongue?
The tongue is so long that you can see it curling up at the back of their body, so 2 or 3 times the length of their body, and they were pretty incredible creatures, and I really enjoyed doing the research. But it was the adventure part of it that made me say, you know what? I don't think I want to be an academic. I want to keep doing this stuff. I liked telling the stories. I liked doing something for a little while and then going on to the next thing. So I sort of got my feet wet working at field stations in Central America, and then at the end of that, I started pitching stories, first to science magazines, and then I branched out. And that was almost, 20 years ago that I started.
We don't count
as
years
a freelancer. Yeah. So thank you for that. Yeah.
So you transitioned from being basically a scientist to, is it fair to say, a scientific journalist? Would that be a fair description?
Yeah, I mean, I say I'm a freelance writer. I write about science a lot, but I've also written about crime. I've written about just the outdoors. I just, I'm curious about stories. So anything that, oftentimes it somehow connects to the natural world, and I think that's what brought me to this story.
I was going to say, this trip
Yeah.
is sort of the perfect combination of that.
Yeah.
So you kayaked in the Central Valley of California on a trip, which we're going to get into. But when you and I spoke earlier, you were telling me about the history of this area and how basically unexplored it was, even up until the 1800s. So tell us a little bit about the area. Where exactly did you paddle, and tell us about the area?
Well, yeah, I mean, for people who live in California, just about the least exotic place you could imagine going is the Central Valley. And I mean, for me, it's a place that is kind of in the way when you want to go to the Sierra or you want to go to San Francisco. It's in the summer, it's miserable and hot, and it's just this incredibly built environment. As we'll get into, the waterways have been dammed and dyked beyond recognition. The land has been flattened into these, massive industrial farms. But remarkably, this was, terra incognita 200 years ago. Basically, when the Spanish arrived in California, 1500s, the first explorers to go to the Central Valley was around the early 1800s. The first European settlement was Fort Sutter up in Sacramento. That was like 1840. And then modernity happened very, very fast with the building all these epic projects to turn it into what it is today, which is this, marvel of industrial agriculture.
And there's a difference between the western and eastern part of the Central Valley, yes?
That's right. I mean, so first off, the Central Valley is 2 valleys. You have the Sacramento Valley, which is the greener, slightly nicer area north of the bay, and then you have the San Joaquin, which is the south. And then the west side of the valley of the San Joaquin is incredibly dry. because all the water is coming from the Sierra, coming from that snowmelt, feeding these rivers. It never quite gets to the west. There are farms there now. With the help of human ingenuity, we've moved water over there, but that soil is pretty bad.
But it used to not be like that. You were talking about John Muir's description of this area, and I was fascinated by that.
I was fascinated by that too. Yeah, John Muir. I think most people here know the most famous conservationist of California. He referred to the Central Valley as the floweriest place I ever walked. And it's just like you scratch your head when you read that and you say, I don't think so. what were you smoking, dude? But in fact, yeah, I mean, those rolling hills, when they actually get water, it is, it's like the super blooms we see in the desert. That was what this terrain was like. And I, when I started working on the story, I read some of these early accounts. John Muir. There was also, I mentioned to you, this guy Thomas Jefferson Mayfield, who wrote this incredible book called Indian Summer. His father was a gold miner, and he describes sort of coming from the Bay Area, going over near Mount Diablo into the valley, and then his dad just kind of drops him off on the tributary of the Kings River, and he says, hey, son, I'm going to be gone for a couple of years to get some gold. Why don't you hang out with these Indians? And so this guy has these amazing stories of growing up in this place, and he describes every summer they would take this raft. They would build a raft out of tule reeds, which is where Tulare County gets its name. There's this long grass that I saw plenty of there, but they would make these giant rafts that I think would fit 10 people. They would float down the Kings River to Tulare Lake, which no longer exists.
How old was he when his dad just dropped him off?
I think he was like 10.
Yeah, well, they'd be calling Child Protective Services.
Right.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah.
So there was an indigenous population, though, that thrived in this area.
Yeah, in the Southern Valley, they were known as the Yokuts people. They now have a casino, and they have a very scarce presence on the ground there. Actually, when these rains happened, there was a bit of a celebration to see the lake coming back, because they have all these stories about it. We haven't even brought this up. I mean, this was the largest wetland west of the Mississippi. This lake was, in wet years, the surface area was 4 times the size of Lake Tahoe.
Wow.
It wasn't that deep, but it was a huge ecosystem. This was, there were grizzly bear, there were Tule elk, ducks, and this was a big hunting grounds for them. Yeah.
And when did farming start in this area?
Pretty soon. I mean, I mentioned the first permanent settlement there was 1840 up in Sacramento, and then gradually, I've seen that the first dikes. People saw Tulare Lake as, okay, this is a promising place. The soil's a little bit better than some of the other areas. But the problem was these seasonal floods would come in, and so you needed to control that. And that started happening around the 1860s and 70s, if I remember correctly. And then the lake, sort of the last gasp of the lake was like the 1890s, early 1900s.
And what were they growing there? Because we talked about what's grown there now, but I'm assuming it wasn't the same kind of crops as today.
Yeah, so if the biggest farmer there today, the name that people hear about is J.G. Boswell, who was known as kind of this cantankerous man. He came from Georgia, I want to say, and he brought cotton over. This was the 1920s. So I'm not actually sure exactly how it all began, but he's the guy who really conquered it and said, we're not going to have floods anymore. We're going to dry this thing out. And he planted up 150,000 acres of Pima cotton, and then it's transitioned over time to some of these other crops.
Right, you're telling me that they're growing a lot of almonds there now.
That is a very recent phenomenon, yeah. Almonds are threatened by the water, so they can't have their feet wet. But the annual crops are still in the lake bottom, but the almonds are expanding, and as I saw, many of them were hurt by the floods.
And you gave me some amazing statistics about that we export. I mean, all this is grown there is not consumed in California or even in this country, pretty much. But there's these huge industrial farms that need a lot of water for their almond crops.
Yeah, so I mean, the valley is a place of many superlatives in terms of how it is the breadbasket of America. I think the number that the industry likes to cite is that 3/4 of agricultural productivity in the U.S. comes from the Central Valley. But that's not actually like the food that ends up on our plates. That's the market value of the crops. And the numbers that I've seen today is that in terms of the water use, so about 80% of California's water goes to agriculture. 30% of that today goes towards nuts in the Central Valley. 90% of those nuts are exported.
Wow.
So we're just giving away our water, basically. Yeah.
For crops that we're not consuming.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's a great context of sort of the area and stuff. And then, as I understand it, the way this all started is it started to rain. And when did that happen, and what prompted you to start investigating this?
So, I mean, like everybody else that lives here, January of 2023 began in a pretty remarkable fashion, which is that it just didn't stop raining. And that continued through February and March. On my street, we live in sort of the hills near Dodger Stadium, and I was having mud come into my bedroom. I was plugging holes and trying to reroute water when I could. As a freelancer that, gets by the skin of my teeth, I was like, it's like, this is really an interesting story. Is there something I can do with this? So I think it was in March when some of these national stories came out about this lake coming back, Tulare Lake, back from the dead, the ghost lake. And I had somewhere in the recesses of my mind this, I'd known a little bit that there had once been this great wetland in the valley, but it just, was so foreign. And then when I saw these pictures that it's coming back, I was fascinated by it. And there was one story in the New York Times, this is an embarrassing fact about my trade as a freelancer, is that oftentimes my stories come from other stories. So I read something somewhere, and it's just one sentence, which was, a couple kayakers kayaked from Bakersfield to San Francisco Bay in 1983, the last time it rained this much. And I said, they did that back then. I wonder if you could do that again this year. And that was how it began.
And did you pitch that at that time to Outside Magazine?
That's right, yeah. I've had a relationship with them for a while, and so I thought this could be a perfect story for my editor, and I sent him a couple paragraphs, and he said, go for it.
So you've got the go-ahead now to do this. Now what? What's your next step? Because you just didn't get a boat and start paddling. So what happened next?
There were a few steps. So, the first thing was I needed a partner. Well, let me bring up, first I needed to know what was happening. Was this possible this year? And so I mentioned these two guys. This image is on the slideshow right now of that's from 1983. That's John Sweetser and a kayak he built himself. So I'd heard that these guys had kayaked there, and I picked up my phone and said, hey, tell me how you did it, because there were not very many details in the story. And if you look at a map of the Central Valley, we haven't gotten into it, but it's pretty hard to figure out which way the water goes. You look at satellite maps, there's not water in the riverbeds, but there might be water here now. So there's all kinds of complicated questions I had about how I get from point A to point B. So I started calling these guys on the phone. And the first thing they told me was it was one of the worst experiences of their life. And so I was like, that's great. Sweetser was the guy is the guy on the left there today, who lives with about 24 cats in a decrepit house on North Bakersfield, and still has these old kayaks. And he is the, landscaping was his job, kayaking was his life. He was involved in kind of a groundbreaking lawsuit related to river access, where he was charged with trespassing on the Kern River, and I think the Sierra Club backed him in fighting that charge. But he was the one who came up with this idea of kayaking from Bakersfield, because he had heard past generations had done it. It seemed like from the research I did, and there were about 5 times people have attempted this in the 1900s, and basically every 10 to 20 years somebody tried to do something in a rowboat, in a motorboat, and he had this dream of doing it in '83. So he called up this buddy of his, and didn't really tell him what the plan was. I mean, they sort
Did
of
they have a plan?
Well, Sweetser had the plan. He had that idea. I'm going to the bay. But he said, we'll just start by going to Tulare Lake. And when they got to the lake, he said, nope, we're going to go all the way. But yes, they had. I mean, it was a rough trip. There was just eating cold beans from a can. They didn't have all the modern equipment we have. One of them reported getting trench foot from just being in this swampy kayak 12 hours a day in 100-degree heat. So it didn't sound like a great trip. I had some advantages. Yeah.
Well, I was going to ask you, after talking to these guys, did you sit there and say, do I really want to do this? What did I get myself into? Or what was your thought process after that?
I definitely, that is kind of the thought process I go through when I pitch any story. It's like, I'm very excited, I sold the story, and then now how am I going to pull this off? Can I pull this off? I spend a lot of time outdoors, but a big adventure like this was not something I'd ever done. It felt, there were just so many unknowns. I was, there's no path, no clear path that I was going to take. So there was a lot of figuring things out along the way.
But they didn't scare you off in talking about this trip, even though they said it was the worst thing they had ever done.
No, they didn't scare me off. I was pretty determined there then, but I knew the next thing I needed was a partner, and that was going to be critical. I needed somebody that I could trust, that would keep the morale high, and so that's how I found Tom Fowlks. He's a photographer who I had done a story with for Audubon magazine, and I just thought this guy would be a lot of fun to spend. You need somebody that you gel with for 10 days. And so I called Tom up and I said, listen, I got this crazy idea. It might not even be possible. And he's like, before I even finished, he's like, I'm in.
Correct.
So that's what
that's
you
the
want.
Kind of guy that's the kind of guy you want. Absolutely.
So
you got your partner now. You've heard the worst. So what's your next step in planning this? I mean, you don't just get in the boat and go. So, food, routes, emergencies, all the planning that goes into a trip like this.
Yeah, the first thing was talking to Sweetser about what route they took, and then I started looking at satellite maps. We have so much more technology now. There was one website that was tracking the spread of water in Tulare Lake, and I was checking it every day because I was trying to figure out what day is this going to be possible, like what week. I wanted to do it as early as possible so that the temps would not be in the hundreds. But I needed to wait till there was enough, the water had maxed out. And so I was just thinking maybe the end of May, maybe beginning of June. So I was watching that very closely.
We have this is one of the satellite maps you looked at?
Yeah, that is exactly it. And so what you're going to see there is, so as we started scouting this out, the original dream was Bakersfield to the bay. That's 350 miles. And in theory, we got as much rain as those guys got in '83. But as you can see, there's this huge gap in the middle of the lake. And it turns out that that guy I mentioned, J.G. Boswell, well, his descendants who still run the company, they did something, which was they built these dikes. This became very controversial in the valley during the floods, but they were protecting all their tomato crops, and everybody was mad at them. So on the east side of the lake, there's the Corcoran prison. That's where Charles Manson temporarily was before his death. And then there's the town of Corcoran, and the town and the state had to raise their own levee, which was 100 feet tall. They had to raise it another 5 feet or so.
So that it didn't flood.
So it didn't flood because this tomato company was basically keeping water off their land. There were people illegally or secretly cutting levees. There was all kinds of funny business that was happening there. But the bottom line was, it was becoming very clear that I was not going to be able to put my kayak in and go across this lake. So that was my first problem.
So how did you solve that? And it's great to hear about planning, because the famous explorer Roald Amundsen said, "Adventure is nothing more than bad planning." So it's good that you did that. So
well, there was some bad planning.
You're in the lake, and how are you getting from point A to one part of the blue to the next part of the blue there?
Well, let me take one more step back,
Sure.
which is, so this lake, basically, it's about 80 miles. Bakersfield is sort of to the southeast, about 80 miles. And the idea to get from Bakersfield, you take the Kern River, and then there was this historic wetlands south of the lake that's become something called the Kern River Flood Channel, which was what John Sweetser had taken during those floods. So that was the idea, was start in Bakersfield, go there, get to the lake, cross the lake, and then you get on the Kings River. Well, a second thing happened, which was that flood channel didn't have any water in it. And that was very hard to see on the satellite maps. So me and Tom, when we got there on the ground, we started driving up and trying to view this. And so this is the third challenge, is most of this land in the valley is private land. So it's very difficult to even get a view of what you're trying to cross. There's barbed wire fences, there's people telling you not to go there. But when we got there, we determined that the water was not flowing in the flood channel either. And I eventually sussed out that was because of the wonderful company, which produces pomegranates and pistachios. Mm-hmm. They have this wild deal with Kern County, where all these families and giant farmers control these little water boards. And they had a situation going where, since the late 90s, they've been taking most of the water from the Kern River and putting it into an underground aquifer that they basically have full control of. And that's something that's brand new. So once again, water, something that might have been possible in '83 was not possible now. So we had to give up on that dream. And so Tom and I, after a really difficult day of scouting, we decided we were going to put in on that north large body of water there, and that's where we'd start, and that was good enough for us.
And then you had to you had to portage to the next water source, or?
Oh, so see where the top of Tulare Lake is? That mm-hmm. We put in on that north shore right there, and we paddled along basically a mile. We were a mile south of the bank, and we paddled due west till we got to the top of the lake, which is the beginning of the current, or the end of the Kings River.
I see.
Yeah.
So you use pedal-powered boats.
Yes.
And what was your reasoning behind that?
Yeah, that was a funny choice. I admit they're not a very dignified mode of travel. I described it in my story as being on a seated stairmaster. They're very interesting because, unlike, you don't move your feet like this, you go like this, because it sort of flaps these paddles under the water. But the decision came about like this. I had this skiing accident in January, which tore the labrum of my shoulder. So I was concerned about this, and I did not tell my editor at the time, because you don't do that. But I was concerned that I wouldn't be able to paddle. And on top of that, I'm not a paddler. So this was a lark. And so somebody said, hey, you know what? These pedal-powered kayaks are actually pretty nice. You're going to be in this place where you're, basically going to be sitting around 10 hours a day. You don't want to be in an enclosed sea kayak. You want to be able to just stretch out and relax. Your legs are bigger than your arms. So why don't you try that? And so so Hobie is the big manufacturer of these things. I called them up, and they hooked me up with a dealer in Dana Point who offered to loan us the boats. So we went down one day, and I wasn't sure if I wanted to take these boats because they're really heavy. They're 100 plus pounds.
Wow.
And they've got these complicated parts that I was worried could break. And actually to portage them, you bring along a set of wheels. But I got in the boat, and I didn't know how fast they would go because they're not really built for speed. They're built for stability. They're built for fishermen. And I hadn't seen very many people use them on a long trip like that. I did actually call one guy who had used something similar on this race across Missouri, and he was a big fan. So that gave me a little bit more confidence. I got in the boat, I recorded my track, and I could tell that actually we could pretty readily go about 3 miles an hour without much effort. And if we wanted to go fast, we could make it up to 6, which is about as fast as you can, paddle in a regular
And it's
kayak.
amazing because I have a 17-foot kayak that weighs 40 pounds. So that's really amazing that they're heavy, and wheels are very important. But do they hold much? Because you don't have a support vehicle going with you, so you have to put all your gear on the boat. So do you know about how much all your gear weighed, and did it all fit?
Yeah, these things are barges. You can put 200 pounds on them. So I had about 100 pounds of gear, and no, it had no problem. And it turned out to be a really good decision to take these because I had my hands free. I could video things. I could take pictures.
Your gear, though, was that mostly food? Were you able to resupply, or did you take all your food and water? And you're on water, but do you have water filters with you? How did that come about?
That was one of the most surprising things about this trip. Is again, I looked at a map and thought, we're paralleling the I-5, right? We're 20 or 30 miles east of the I-5 most of the way. It shouldn't be that hard to resupply, but you zoom in and you look at where the river goes, and it turns out there was only one spot on the 230 mile trip where we could actually get out of the kayak and walk to a gas station or somewhere to eat. Everywhere else it was 3-4 miles. We're not going to stop and walk that way, leave our boats and walk to a gas station resupply. So we packed everything and brought everything on our own. We filtered water, which was a little bit sketchy. There were, the local health authority, in times of flood says don't drink the water, especially in Tulare Lake, which had all of this agriculture runoff. When I put my boat in, there were, cow turds on the shore. There was a dairy operation right there. I'd read reports going into it that there were probably, tens of thousands of chickens drowned underwater. So that was kind of nasty. But once we got on the river, and the further north we went, you get more of these nice Sierra stream melt coming in, and I felt a little more.
And what was your goal a day? 10 miles a day? 30 miles a day?
Well,
I said goal, not what you actually did.
To be honest, it was not mapped out to that degree because there were so many unknowns. So, the first thing is if the route begins in Tulare Lake, and the two main rivers we were taking are the Kings River and the San Joaquin River. So the Kings River comes down from the Sierra, and it splits, and there's a fork that goes south into the lake. The lake is basically this inland sea. It had no outlets. And that means that when we got out of the lake, we had to paddle upstream. And we were going less than a mile an hour. So, we weren't making it that 10 hours, we were barely making 10 miles. And then later on, when we were going with the flow, it was like magic. But there were so many portages there were so many scary dams we had to cross, we had to navigate, there was private property we had to navigate, that it really slowed us down.
Well, that what struck me is, so
Yeah.
in your portages, you're probably portaging on private property, I imagine. Did you ever have any issues with respect to landowners?
We did have some issues with respect to landowners. Yeah, so there was, when we started the trip, unfortunately, and I didn't tell Tom this because I thought it might affect our relationship, but the sheriff...
You were good at omitting
Yeah.
stuff to people.
You know, the less he knew, the better. So the sheriff had said that Tulare Lake is off limits. And so I was like, oh, that's a problem, but we're only going to be there for a day. And then the next thing we learned was that the Kings River was also, there was a closure, an emergency closure order because it was at flood stage. And then the San Joaquin River, the same thing by the sheriffs in most of these counties where we were passing through. And so, at that point I was pretty locked into it. I'd gotten the boat, I'd gotten the assignment, and I didn't think anything was going to happen. And so, you talked about planning. And so I thought probably the best time for a covert mission is Memorial Day weekend. No, I didn't think about that ahead of time. And so we were on the water on our second day, and we pulled off. And so legally, there were questions about how legal these closure orders are, whether the sheriff really can do that in a federally navigable body of water. But I don't have a team of lawyers working for me. But we knew that the law says you are able to get out of the water between the low tide and the high tide, or the high water mark. Of course, the river's at flood stage, so there wasn't really much of a high water mark. So we just sort of would get off where we could find a little island here or there. And it was really neat because these would be the places animals would bed down. So you'd get off on this island, and this is kind of graphic, but you would smell the urine of like all the deer that basically had been crowding on there. But yeah, so we stopped one day for lunch, and a couple came driving by behind. We were next to an almond plantation. A couple came driving by in a little bobcat, and they were very curious about us. And they said, what are you doing here? And we said, oh, we're just, we're kayaking. They're like, you're not supposed to be here. And we're, and then they said, where'd you start? And I said Tulare Lake. And I thought this would sort of interest them. This was a cool thing to do. And they just sort of turned away and they zipped off. And I said, uh-oh. Because 10 minutes later, we were, we went under a road bridge, and there were two sheriff's vehicles waiting for us, and calling us out of the river at the bullhorn. I tried to sort of pretend like I didn't hear them at first, and I kept going, but Tom was behind me, so I knew it wouldn't be good for him. So we pulled off, and it was a terrible place to stop. It was like really muddy, and it was, we were like hip deep in water, and they wanted us to carry all our gear up the steep, muddy bank. And they were very uncompromising. They said, this is, we're taking everybody off the river. We've had people die. This is not okay.
Was that true?
What was it true that people had died? Or?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd heard about a farm. There were people who died on some of the rougher rivers coming right off of the Sierra, or some rafters, or amateur rafters, you might say. There was a farmer that had gotten swept away in the water. There were stories like that were happening. But I'm a professional. I work for Outside Magazine. I'm in my pedal-powered kayak. I know what I'm doing. But we and when we talked to the sheriff, they were actually pretty nice. They were like, hey, this is kind of a cool trip, but we can't let you do this. And I was like, when do you think the river will open again? And they're like, we don't know. And I said, well, how far is the next county over? And they said, oh, it's about 5 miles. And I said, do they have a closure order? And they're like, I don't know. We just worry about our county. So I called up the guy that had put us in the river. He was a farmer who lived near Tulare Lake, and he had a flatbed truck. And he said, I'll come and pick you guys up. And he picked us up, and he drove us to the county line, and we put our boats back in.
That's an interesting portage.
Yeah. And it was at that point that I discovered that I have a superpower as a journalist, which is that the state law that empowers the sheriff to close rivers actually exempts journalists. So that's how journalists are able to, go to, forest fires and different emergency zones. And so I decided that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. So how did I find that out? Because we were stuck in a tent. It was Memorial Day, and we weren't sure if we were going to bail or if we were going to keep going. And I just started doing a bunch of research on my phone. So that's what happened. I mean, you would think I would have done that ahead of time, but yeah.
That's great. So you're now into the next county and you're paddling. Yeah. And how many more miles do you have to go from this point?
That was day 2 that we got pulled off the river.
Jeez.
So yeah, it was not a good situation. And day 1 was the day that a bullet whizzed over my head. So we didn't even talk about that.
No, let's go back to day 1 for a moment. Yeah.
So yeah, day 1 was this epically long day where we were paddling upstream, and people were starting. This was the day when we saw the most number of people out on the river. They were barbecuing, they were fishing, and there was sort of this high bluff on the left-hand side of the river, and we heard shots, but we couldn't quite place where they were coming from. And Tom was a little ahead of me, and there was sort of silence for a while, and then suddenly I hear it really loud, and there was a plunk about 10 feet to my right. And then I just started yelling. I was like, "We're on the river!" And this guy came out, and he's like, "Oh, sorry." So
he wasn't shooting at you then.
He was not shooting at me, no. Yes.
That's good.
But yeah.
But you had some other adventures too. You hit some dams that the water was so high, you were electrocuted at one point in time. So tell us about that.
Yeah, I mean, the unknown of this was the kind of the man-made infrastructure. All these dams at high water are kind of hard to see sometimes, and you see you'll just see that horizontal line and then a little piece of metal, and you think, can I go through that or not? And oftentimes, the water is moving pretty slowly, and then it starts to speed up like it does in the cartoons. And the thing about these pedal powered kayaks is, it's very natural when you're just going forward, but if you want to try to change direction, these have a transmission, so there's this thing you can pull, and then suddenly you're going backwards. But it's not sudden; it's kind of clunky. So, and we had a backup paddle if anything went wrong. And so also when we started, when we would encounter an obstacle that was frightening us, we would reach for the paddle, and then at that point it's kind of like patting your head and rubbing your belly, because you're trying to switch from pedaling to paddling, and so there were multiple times when we got a little too close to some of these dams. We'd pull off, and as I said, a lot of the river, there would be barbed wire right at the bank of the river, and the banks of these rivers were just fully undercut because of the floods. So, it just became, every dam was kind of an ordeal to get through. And so, every obstacle is different. So the dams, we had to portage, and they were a pain. And then there were bridges that were sometimes very low, and we'd had to do the limbo to get under. And then we came to this one dam where it was clearly like there was no chance we could go under this dam. So I had the brilliant idea of just lining the boat, where we tie a rope to one end, let it go under, and then Tom would be on the other side of the bridge, and he would catch my boat and bring it to the beach. And I happened to notice that there was electric cattle fence right there on the shore, and I took that mental note. I said, "Don't touch that thing." And I passed my boat on, and my boat was under the bridge, and there was like just a little riffle. And I left all my gear on the boat, 100 pounds of gear, and the boat just kept sweeping into this riffle, and so it wanted to turn sideways and catch a little water and flip, and so I'd have to pull it back and then drop it down. So it ended up being a little tricky, and finally Tom gets the boat, but I can't see where Tom is, and so I was starting to get a little worried because he's on the other side of this bridge. Oh, this is the bridge right there, and that's Tom. So I yell for Tom. I said, "Hey, do you have the boat?" And I can't hear him. So I climb up on the bridge, and I said, "Oh, looks like you have the boat. Great." And so that was a really important task I did. And so I come back down, and as I'm sort of hanging off the bridge, somehow, whether it was a piece of the electric fence or it was touching the metal on the bridge, I'm still not even sure. It just was like that.
Wow.
It hit me, and all I remember is I was looking down, because I was, there was no real bank here, so I was actually like about 4 feet in on the bridge, because I was in like hip-deep water. And I looked down, and I just see the swirling water, and if I'd like passed out or something, I would have gone under and just been. But I got off the bridge, and well, I forgot to tell you, I tried to get Tom to go the way I went, and Tom's like, "No, I think I'm going to go around." And it took a while to recover. I actually had this bizarre thing where I kept burping for several hours. Which I think is like a stimulation of your nervous system, right? And so, I was worried that was going to be my lifelong ailment from this trip. But I recovered after a few
That's
hours.
Great. Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. And what day was this?
Oh, this was this must have been like about day 6. So we were getting into it then.
Okay.
Yeah.
And did the river start to get more scenic as you were going along? You said that, and
yeah,
and a more enjoyable paddle at that point in time.
Sorry, I'm burping because it's a psychosomatic thing. So in the beginning, this bleakness of the valley was there. You're in the Tulare Lake, which is not very attractive. There's almost no natural vegetation. And then we're going up, and most of that beginning of the Kings River, it's very channelized. There were some trees on the bank, but then we hit the North Fork of the Kings River, where we're going with the flow. And then intermittently, we started to get these interesting things, a little island in the middle of the river where there were, oak trees. Oh, this is nice. And we went through this thing called the Fresno Slough. And that was kind of the beginning of this transition. There's this whole series of parks, these unknown parks that nobody talks about, these national wildlife refuges, state parks like Great Valley Grasslands, that nobody visits, and they were beautiful. They were, in these areas, when we get about, day 3, 4, the river at that point, it's 1 to 2 miles wide. So it's flooding the adjacent farmland, where the channel is like barely, we would float out of the channel and not even know it. We'd get in these little, looping eddies, and we'd come around again and again, and we'd say, "Oh, actually it's that way." And it was gorgeous. There were these beautiful rookeries of birds, egrets and cormorants. There were just hundreds of them weighing down the branches in these flooded trees. And these are, hundreds of years old oak trees that are 100 feet tall, beautiful trees. I was told that these are the trees that were too big to knock over with a tractor. That's how they're described.
Yeah. But there's these parks, national parks and wetlands and stuff that are accessible to this day by road. Is that accurate?
That's accurate. Yeah, I don't think they're that impressive when there's not water there. But they are pretty magical. That was the beauty of this trip, was this chance to see the valley in the full flush, to see what it could be, what it was in the 1800s.
Right.
And so these valleys, the Great Valley grasslands and the San Luis National Wildlife Refuge, they're parks that are just right on the river that are, I don't really know why they're there. They're basically there because these areas flooded, and so nobody wanted to farm there. So that's why there is a little bit of nature left. Yeah.
And you made it to the bay.
We did, yeah.
And where in the bay did you enter?
Well, we came out at Stockton.
Out of Stockton.
So sort of the San Joaquin River spits you out on the Stockton ship channel, and then we ended up in the Delta region, and that was it's kind of like the fun of the trip was over at that point in some sense. It was very civilized up there, but we had our goal was to make it all the way to Antioch. That's what I said. I thought, okay, this is reasonable. I want the bragging rights of saying I made it to the San Francisco Bay. But on our very last day, the winds picked up. Well, first off, once you get to the Delta region, you're supposed to time your movement with the tides. And if you do it right, you get flushed out, and it's glorious. And I looked at the tide tables. It looked like it was going to be good. Got out that morning, and the water was just flat. The reason it was flat was the wind was blowing so hard, it was counteracting any of the tidal movement. So we're paddling against the wind, and then when we would open up into these areas of the bay, getting into what's called the Big Break, which is kind of the easternmost part of the San Francisco Bay, there was a small craft advisory, and there were these pretty big waves. And this is where those pedal-powered kayaks were, a detriment, because unlike a sea kayak, which cuts through the waves, these sit-on-top kayaks just
Bounce
flop
up and down, yeah.
And so, we had this question, for me, the story that I was writing, it was about the floods in the valley. Getting to the Antioch was about the bragging rights. And then the Mexican restaurant that was very close to us.
I was just going to ask you, when you got off the water into civilization,
Yes.
what was the first meal that you had?
Well, yes, we paused at a dock. We said, should we keep going? And I looked at my phone and I said, it looks like there's a Mexican restaurant 1 block away. And so that is where we quit.
How was the food?
Yeah, it was delicious. Yes, I had a michelada, some enchiladas, and nachos. Yes.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, with the few minutes we have left, one of the things that we talked about was, besides this amazing trip that you did and stuff, you really got an education about, and I don't think people really realize that water in California is a political football. Mm-hmm. It is of great value. There could be wars raised over water and stuff. And so help us understand sort of water in California, what you learned about water and those issues in California.
Yeah, I think the first thing I learned was it gave me this new appreciation of what the valley could be, what it was like. And I think I learned so much about how water has been, manipulated there. The San Joaquin River is a river in name only. The river, it comes from the Sierra, but farmers take so much, they divert so much water in the upper San Joaquin that the Sacramento River is basically brought in to replace the water in the lower section. And then basically farmers take so much off the lower section that there's a section that is normally completely dry. But what I learned by going through there was, seeing that it actually is possible to restore some of these areas. I stopped by this one, what is now California's newest park, but at the time it was not a park. It's called Dos Rios. It's where I think it's the Tuolumne River meets the San Joaquin, and they've been doing they've been buying out dairy farmers who have put their land in areas that are regularly flooding, and they've converted it to a state park there and restored some of the land, and it's beautiful. And so, to answer your question, I guess I saw the beauty of the valley, and it also sort of made me fearful of the future, because in the year since I took that trip, you think that this would cause some kind of reckoning, and that people would be like, okay, we got to make sense of our water resources. We were in the middle of a drought. We got this flood. Let's reset things. But these water fights have gotten more intense. There's a new groundwater law that these water boards everybody's supposed to, bring their pumping down to a sustainable level. And all these companies, including Boswell, they're suing the counties, they're suing the water board, they're suing each other. And it doesn't look good. If we know anything about the future with climate change, it's only going to get worse.
And that's the thing. We may be going into a drought again, and sucking all the groundwater out, which happened in the last drought. And I don't think we have learned our lesson. Would
No,
you say
I don't
that?
think so.
Yeah. What a fascinating adventure. I want to leave some time for questions because I know there's going to be some. So, would you handle the mic for us, David?
Absolutely.
Great, thank you. Anybody have any questions for Brendan?
Liquor's for drinking and water's for fighting, right?
Yeah.
That's right.
I saw one day first came back here.
I spent some time in San Joaquin Valley last summer as well, and I got a sense from the people that I was around that they were very scared of Boswell. Did you pick up any of that energy?
Yeah, I read a bit about his, he is a large figure there. The company is very secretive. They don't tend to talk to the media very much. And actually it was kind of entertaining because when we put in on the lake, I had this app on my phone. I don't know if you know this app called Onyx. It's like a hunting app, but it tells you exactly who owns land that you're on. And so I could look on there and I could see I was floating over Boswell's farmland. And I was just thinking how mad he would be if he knew. But yes, he's very powerful. There are other people who are powerful in that area too, and that nobody likes each other down there. So
I'm assuming that
Yeah.
Boswell and I forget their names, but the folks that own Wonderful, the
Yeah.
Resnicks,
the Resnicks, yeah.
do they fight each other, or do they work together, or are they in different areas?
They're in slightly different areas. The soap opera version of it is there's Boswell, and then there's this guy named Vidovich who he's fighting with. And Vidovich was a big farmer that's become kind of like the water wheeler dealer, where he's been piping water to the Resnicks, who own the Wonderful company, and so that's led to several lawsuits. Yeah, so
Is Boswell the one they wrote the book called The King of California about?
exactly, yeah,
Pretty good book if you want to
Yeah.
read about the crazy water. Yeah, of course.
yeah.
I'm just curious about equipment. I remember, I think when you first told me the story, I think there was something wrong with like your kayaks at some point that you had to like figure out. But any like surprising equipment that you brought that like you used and like was a lifesaver versus like anything you thought would hold up just got completely destroyed and you had to continue to fix?
Yeah, so, one of the things I discovered, I was so glad that these boats got loaned to us. Turned out one of them had a leak in it. So I found that out on day one as I'm in the middle of Tulare Lake. I just said, I don't think there should be this much water in my hole. You can store stuff in the hole. And I was opening it to get snacks, and there was some water sloshing around. So we pull up to shore, I empty it out, and I'm like, maybe I just didn't notice it before. We go another hour, the hole's filling up again. And there were about 2 days, it was actually until after we got pulled off the river by the sheriff, and we had sort of a little bit of extra time on the dry land, that I was like, you know what, I'm gonna try to fix this. I had some aqua seal, which is usually used for fixing wetsuits. I couldn't find a leak, but I just basically put it in every little nook and cranny I could find, and miraculously it sealed the boat. So I was very happy about that. Other things I liked, I guess, good dry bags. One of the huge mistakes I made, and this is pretty embarrassing too. I try to be always prepared, but my biggest fear on camping trips is being hot. I just hate being hot, and was not worried about being cold, so I didn't bring a sleeping bag. And we were freezing every night. So it was like windy and cold.
Did you have a tent, or did you just bivvied out?
I had a tent, and this is another unfortunate thing. I decided I was going to save some weight by not bringing a rain fly because there's no way it was going to rain again. So there would just be wind rustling over me. I did have a ground cloth, which I wrapped myself up in, and I had this old emergency blanket. But when I pulled it out, it just turned to shreds. And so, anyways, I will never travel without a sleeping bag again. So that's all.
Oh, in terms of the public health aspects, there are a number of outbreaks of neoplasia, cancer, in the Central Valley. Was that of concern to you?
I don't know much about that. Tell me.
Oh, the pollutants are carcinogenic,
Mm.
and that was of considerable interest. Movies about this, famous stories, and you mentioned the pollution that you faced when you got in with all the agricultural chemicals, and there's plenty of oil development in Kern County.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I am aware that, I mean, that's some of the dirtiest oil in the country that comes out of those oil wells, and the air quality there is terrible. I didn't know there was, there's cancer clusters in some areas.
Yes.
Okay.
Speaking of public health, how about your own sanitation? What did you do with your human waste?
Buried it.
Good on you. And were there mosquitoes?
A lot of these areas were pretty swampy, and we did get nailed by mosquitoes the first night. It was terrible, but it was actually not that bad the rest of the time. So,
Can you tell us how you actually filtered or treated your water to drink?
one of these Sawyer minis, like a bladder, put 3 liters in it and then squeeze it. Yeah. I've had several filters, and that's my favorite for sure.
Good. You didn't say anything about the smell. How was the smell on this trip? Were there days with fresh air, or was it all stinky?
You know, I really braced myself for this trip being just a sufferfest and being, totally unpleasant. And the portages were terrible. There was obviously some adversity we faced, but when we were on the river, it was beautiful and it was really nice. There was that section in Tulare Lake where we got whiffs of the dairy operations and things like that, but no, there was nothing too off-putting.
When you portage, did you carry or did you put your wheels on or?
Actually, my wheels broke, so that was another thing that happened. Tom got like the good set of wheels, and then I was given like the dinky set, and it was day one that my wheel broke when I was portaging over a dam, and so at that point, yeah, we just had to trade off the wheels. So we would make these epic shuttle runs where it was like take the boat, take the gear, bring the wheels back, or.
And are you guys still on speaking terms?
Tried to get him to come tonight, but he said he was busy. Yeah.
I don't want to think about that.
Yeah.
Could you tell us more about the wildlife aspects of this?
Yeah, sure.
We actually went through areas of brackish water, which is considerable interest in terms of biology that you know more about than I do, certainly.
So in the Delta, I didn't see too much. The Delta is an interesting region for sure, and it's got a lot of those introduced fish. But in terms of wildlife, in this area where there's this chain of parks, we saw lots of river otters. We saw a family of otters, which is known as a romp. We heard beavers. Beavers slap their tails when they are scared. I didn't see a beaver, but I heard those slaps all the time. And then the deer, we would come around a corner and just see a deer and a fawn hanging out on a little island. It was, which is not that unusual to see a deer, but it was neat to see them, how they're navigating this flooded ecosystem. What else did we see? And then the birds they were spectacular. There were so many of them. They were just all, yeah. What else did we see?
On the bird. Yeah, it wasn't it on the flyaway, and you mentioned this was a great wetland. Did the drying out change the pattern of migration, and did any of it come back and respond to this one year?
You know, I'm not sure. I bet they had a baby boom, that's for sure. And yeah, it is one of the most important wetlands in, Central California. Yeah.
I think one of the great things about kayaking that I love so much is seeing wildlife from that perspective of the boat, as opposed to being in a car or being high up. You're sort of at their level, particularly like otters and that sort of thing. That's been really great to see.
Yeah, and your stealth. They're not
Right.
They're not scared by you.
Yeah.
It's great.
So one other question I have for you is there more questions? Sure, go ahead.
So you had mentioned you'd never done any adventures like this before. Do you have any ideas? Has this inspired anything else, like other semi-masochistic journeys through our natural past?
Thanks for asking that, because my next question was, what's your next adventure? So that was perfect.
Well, I biked from San Francisco to Santa Barbara just a couple weeks ago, so that was fun. But I'm looking for a new adventure. I want an adventure with a good story behind it. So if you have any suggestions, I'd love to hear them. Yeah.
And I have another question about
Yeah.
the Central Valley water. I'm told when the big earthquake comes, it's going to shatter the levees in the delta. Lots of the delta will flood. It'll also probably sever the connection that brings water to SoCal. Did your research come across on what will happen to the water when the big one comes?
Wow, no, I didn't know any of that.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Man's engineering can and will be reversed.
Okay.
And the worst thing is the big pipeline, or the California Water Project,
Yeah.
and other things it brings, that may get severed, and we may lose the water supply to SoCal. That's why they're trying to
Right.
build this twin tunnels thing.
Any other questions? Well, great. Well, Brendan, thank you so much. This was just fascinating.
All right. Thanks
And
for having me.
very much appreciate you sharing it with us. And for those of you that are here, please come back. You're welcome anytime. For those of you who are watching us online, you're welcome here every Thursday. We have amazing speakers like Brendan coming. And so thank you all for coming to the Adventures Club of Los Angeles. Thank you.
All right.
That was awesome.
Thanks, Alan.
Hey, that was a great job. That was great. That was fun.
I hope I did the looking at the.
Oh, no, it was perfect. Yeah, no, that's great. Yeah.